So we'll go on ahead and get started. It is Mayor Gott's birthday today, so if you see her in the rest of this evening, be sure to wish her a happy birthday. My name is Brian Hander. I'm the Mayor Pro Tem. Welcome to History in the Hall. So what we do with these events, it's the second Tuesday of each month, leading up to our Dock Holiday Festival in April. And normally we dedicate it to Western history or local history. And this year, since it's our 150th birthday, we dedicated it to Denison 150, and each lecture is dedicated to a 50-year portion of our history. So this portion is going to be 1922 to 1972. Last time when we left off, it was looking really exciting. We had started planning for our 50th anniversary, and then the railroad strike hit, and we lost a huge portion of our population, and it kind of looked a little doom and gloom. But there were a lot of things on the horizon still to come. And really, this is my favorite 50 years. It's very, very, very exciting. So let's dive right on in. So 1924, this was the Elks Lodge up until 1924 when it burned. It was located at Gandy and Rusk, where it's still today. And what they had to do once it burned was raise enough funding to build a new one. Well, they had lost quite a few members because the railroad had left. But they were able to still, with local church donations, able to pick up the rest of the tab and start breaking ground shortly thereafter. So I'm going to take this off for just a second because I realize this is on this other screen. This table. So what we have here, this is a picture of that cornerstone laying that they did shortly after that building burned. And the building still exists today if you go over to Gandy and Rusk. So it's pretty cool, and it shows all the different people that helped donate and make that Elks Lodge possible. So that was kind of the first big exciting thing that happened after the railroad strike. The next thing that was really, really big for the community, especially the east side, was a new Raynal Elementary School was built. So the original one was from the 1890s. It had aged really, really badly, and it was in need of a new school. So the school board, which was headed by W.B. Munson Jr., while his dad helped found the town, W.B. Munson Jr. was really big in building up all of the schools. So his big legacy was Raynal, Peabody, which today is the admin building, and getting the new football stadium built, which after his death was named after him. So this school was one of the nicest schools in Denison when it was built. It's a Mark Lemon design, and if you've ever been down to Dallas, to SMU, he designed their campus, and this was one of his very first designs. So it shows you kind of his very, very beginning of his career, and the budget that we gave him to work with obviously wasn't as big as that of the Southern Methodist University. But he did come back to Denison shortly after this, and 40 years later, to build Waples Methodist Church. So we have two of his designs that still stand in the city today, and this is still on the east end of the railroad tracks, but it does look a little bit altered now. So what the next big thing that had happened, we talked about last time that we had a hotel. It was originally a college, and it had burned. It was one of Denison's worst fires. Everyone made it out alive. It was in the 500 block of Main, where Main Street Mall is right now. And it looked like this. So it was really, really an impressive structure, and it had burned in 1920. And it was a really big, devastating blow to the community because that's where a lot of our civic clubs met, and that was our true hotel. So the club that decided we really needed to build a new one was the Chamber of Commerce. Part of that was because the week before the old hotel burned, they were still having their weekly meetings at the hotel, so they didn't have a spot to even have a meeting. So they tried to find local investors, local Denison people that might be willing to help build a new hotel, and it actually happened. The Simpson brothers, along with their brother-in-law, Mr. Crumpton, decided to erect the Hotel Simpson, as it was originally known. They did decide on a new location. The Simpsons already owned land here, so it worked a little better for them. And The unique thing about this is, today we have the Denison Development Alliance, right? So if someone wants to come in and build something, they're able to use a portion of our tax dollars to incentivize that. Back then, we didn't have it. So the Chamber of Commerce tried to kind of do that. They tried to help bridge that gap. Well, the Simpson brothers needed about $50,000 more, which in the 1920s was a lot of money. So the Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors raised that money amongst themselves. In a meeting, one meeting, pledged $50,000. And this isn't hundreds of people, this is about a dozen men. So it was really, really impressive, the community support. They even went so far as to eventually created a stock company, and only Denison people owned stock in this hotel. It wasn't owned by anyone else but Denison stockholders. And it was really quite successful up until the 1930s, and it just couldn't weather the storm after the Great Depression. It eventually changed hands and was called Hotel Denison. Then it was sold to the Alcinet chain of hotels before it was eventually shut down. Now later on we'll learn some future plans for this. This will be in our very last one, so you have to come to the fourth meeting.
What year did it open?
So this one opened October 1st, 1924. That's when they had their grand opening. They had it from 12 o'clock noon to 12 o'clock midnight. Does anyone know why they picked that date? It was their mom's birthday. So the Simpson brothers wanted to do something special for their mom, who had lived in Denison. They were a pioneering family, and so they had the grand opening on her birthday. 2 weeks later, Harry Houdini stayed in the hotel. So, and it's in the newspaper. This isn't a made-up thing. He really did stay there, and he's quoted as saying how much he enjoyed it and all of that. And I told this to Casey Shires, and he was shocked because he has the guest books sitting in his garage. So, now he's flipping through them, seeing if he's got Harry Houdini's signature. So it was really pretty cool. But we've got some pictures of how the hotel originally looked, and the original Denison Herald, the front page when the hotel opened, and it goes into great detail. It's really, really cool. But that was probably the largest civic undertaking that Denison's ever done, and it still stands today. And the reason it still stands partly is because they built it to be fireproof. Between every floor is concrete. There's no wood in the construction of it going up. And obviously they did that because their last hotel had burned, and no one would sign on to this project unless they made it fireproof. They even had fireproof mattresses. They were made out of asbestos, but they were fireproof. Yeah. So 1925 did see a loss of another big structure that we had. This is not that structure. I'm just telling you some other stuff that happened that year. But the 21 Club, remember that was the first women's club in Texas to own their own building. Well, due to subsoil conditions, the building had started shifting really badly, and it had to be demolished. It was condemned. In 1925, they did eventually leave their building, and it was demolished. And today there are homes on the site. But an important structure was also built. Mercy Hospital opened at 1030 West Main, and this was under the direction of Dr. Roscoe C. Riddle. So this hospital served the African American community. There wasn't anything like this before this hospital opened in Denison or the area. Patients came as far away as Shreveport just to get care because there wasn't another facility for them. And so this was a really, really, really important thing for Denison and for its citizens to have. And when they dedicated the building, they had thousands of people show up. The mayor gave a big address. There was a band that performed. They went all out. It was really, really cool. Mayor Hibbard was the mayor when this one was done. In March of 1927, Terrell High School was established. So, Denison originally had segregated schools. We had Denison High School and Terrell High School. Before Terrell, it was Anderson School. So when Terrell High School opened in 1927, it was named after A.H. Terrell, who was an early day businessman in Denison, as well as a pastor. And his building still stands today. It's really, really pretty cool. And the first principal was W.R. Wims. A couple other things that happened in this decade. 1928, we had our own airport open. It was called Gray Field, and it was Denison's answer to Sherman's Municipal Airport. We wanted to kind of have our own thing. It was on the east side of town, and it was just in a cow pasture. It was just a really level spot. There were no concrete runways or anything like that. And the way the city contributed to it, it was kind of a private venture, again, funded by mostly stockholders from town, is we tried to pave roads to get out to it. That was the really big thing, was can you pave roads? And this stayed in operation for quite a while and even had a little flight school. So it was pretty cool. And then 1930, we finally got our next census. So remember, our population was up, we were close to 17,000, 18,000. Then that railroad strike hit. By 1930, our population was 13,000. So it was pretty low, but we were still doing lots of really big projects. 1934, Loy Lake is completed. This was originally known as Grayson County Park. So this was a project of the county. They needed a park because back in the day we didn't have Lake Texoma, we didn't have a big lake like that, a big recreation facility. So the county thought that this would be a good way for the funds to be used, especially from WPA projects, to build this park that everyone would be able to utilize. Now the reason it's located in Denison and not Sherman is because the county judge at that time was from Denison. So Mr. Loy made sure it was on our side of the city limit line. This structure here, as most of the structures there, were built of stone. It's all native stone that was found at the site. Originally, this housed a water tower. It was meant to hide that tower so that it all looked cool and kept with the theme. But the water tower that was inside of it was eventually torn down. So now we just have this really cool castle-like structure. The 30s also brought some really cool things. 1934, the first night game ever was played at Munson Stadium. Prior to that, they didn't have field lights, so they couldn't play night games. They had to make sure they ended early enough before it got too dark. 1935, the Denison Public Library opened. So it opened at the site it is today, at the corner of Gandy and Rusk, and it originally opened in the Munson home. So remember W.B. Munson, the original founder, this was the home that he built when he came to town. And the reason it was right there is because that's right behind the W.B. Munson block. So it was close to his office and everything. And eventually he moved down to Morton Street, and his daughters were very upset because that was so far out of town at the time. And there was a boys' school at St. Xavier's, so why would they have to move so far? But Eloise Munson, his youngest child, donated the home to be the home of the public library. You know, we always kind of talk about our firsts and big exciting things. One thing that Denison was well known for was we were the largest town in Texas to not have a public library. So this was a group, the Alpha Junior Delphians. This was their answer to that problem. They raised money and they started their own little group, and with no city funding, opened a public library. And originally it had 1,200 books total. And some of those books they stored, I mean, it looked like a house when you went in there. The books were stored in bathtubs, in kitchen cabinets. I mean, it was a makeshift operation, but they did a really good job with it. In 1936, this is kind of when the big Texas birthday celebration was going on. And so all municipalities across Texas were trying to clean up. How can we make everything look better? Well, the 100 block in Denison is the oldest block because that's closest to the railroad. So those buildings had been deemed as the ugliest or the oldest, the most decrepit. So there was a really big push to modernize that area. So what the city did was they bought a portion of the block in the 100 block on the south end, demolished the buildings and built this municipal building, which is really pretty incredible. And that's where City Hall and the jail were. And eventually City Hall was expanded, stucco was added, and it was recently renovated to be the police department. So that building still exists under there. When they renovated it, they opened up those original window openings and the glass was still there, and it's about to be reused on a building downtown. So it's kind of cool, it's coming full circle, but the original jail cell is still in there as well, and that's where the first Main Street office was. That's where the first Main Street director had her office, so you've really moved up in the world, Donna, from that first one. But these pictures, like some of these color photos, are from old 8mm slides that were found in the Chamber of Commerce when they just started renovating. So these have never been seen. These are really, really cool. We also talked about how Waples, when they built their new church, the Methodist Church South, how they stayed on the south side of Main Street, and then there was the first Methodist Church, which was the Methodist Church North, and it was on the north end of Maine, and how that kind of related to the Civil War. Well, between 1938 and 1939, both of those churches merged, and that was a national merger between the North and the South Methodist churches. And since the North Church was known as First Methodist, but it had the smaller church, they decided to go to Waples. And that's why today we don't have any First United Methodists like most towns. So if anyone ever asks now, you know the answer to that one. A really exciting thing happened for Denison in 1939 when funds were allocated for the Denison Dam. So there was a man named George Moulton, and he lived in the big house, the Inn of Many Faces, or the Davis on Morton Street. That's where he lived. And he was kind of a geologist in his spare time. He just enjoyed that kind of thing. He wasn't really trained in it. And for a long time, Denison had been thinking, we need some flood control, we need some stuff. And he went out and he said, they need to build a dam right here. It'll fix everything. So the government, of course, took that under advisement, did a couple $1 million worth of studies, and the spot was within 6 feet of where he pointed. So just know it was a Denison man that pointed at the ground, and the Denison Dam is built there. But this was a really, really big deal. And the city and the chamber had pushed so hard to get this that's why it was named the Denison Dam. That's why it's not the Texoma Dam or anything like that, because we were the ones that pushed, and we actually funded some of the studies to get this because it was affecting our properties along the river. And we knew that there would be great potential in a lake coming into town. Let's see some other things that happened that year. June of 1939, the first male principals ever were appointed to Denison schools. Prior to that, it was all females. October 16th, 1939, the new Sam Houston Elementary School is opened. And this was in large part to the Sugar Bottom community. They were, when it came time to build that new school, the school district thought, we'll move it to a new neighborhood. We don't need to rebuild right here. And that community rallied, and Houston, the one they built in 1939, is still there. So it's pretty impressive. In 1940, our population had started rising slightly. We were at 15,500. In 1941, Denison got their first full-time nurse at a school. So prior to that, there was no school nurse. You just had to rub some dirt in it and go on. But that was one school nurse for all the entire district. So still, you just had to hope they were at your school that day, I guess. And then we start seeing, the big thing that we're going to start seeing are our foundations be created and our trusts. So the R.D. Burney Trust was created in 1941. If you remember, he's the one that he donated the clock tower and the bell to go in that, he donated the clock tower to house the bell in the 1914 high school. He owned the building that's right next to City Hall today, where Vintage Mercantile is. And he was just a really big supporter of Denison, and he didn't have any heirs. So when he died, he left all of his money to go into a trust that still exists today. So it's really, really cool, and it benefits Denison in really awesome ways. So this picture here, August 1941, was when the Perrin Air Force Base opened. This was the first basic flying school that was put into operation following the Japanese bombing at Pearl Harbor. They had more than 10,000 students that received their training before it was eventually deactivated in November of '46. We'll find out it was reactivated in other capacities, but as you can see, it was a huge complex, and the runways and everything like that still exist today. 1943, the first married women were allowed to be teachers in Denison. So, prior to that, you couldn't. 1943 also saw the completion of the Denison Dam. I would have done a completion photo, but this is way cooler. And we've all seen the photos of the dam completed with the lake. But this just shows you the magnitude of how big a project this was. When it was completed, it was the largest rolled earth fill dam in the world with a spillway height of 640 feet. and they thought it would only go over the spillway once every 100 years.
What year was that?
That was in 1943. So that same year, we also saw the creation of the B Munson Foundation. So it was not created by B Munson or his son. It was created by Eloise Munson in memory of her father. Eloise was a titan of industry. She always signed all of her papers E. Munson, and most people did not realize she was a woman when they were doing business with her. They thought that she was a man. She ran the Denison cotton mill for a long time. So you got to think in the 40s, that was not something that ever happened. And she just did everything for this community, donating the library building, funding for additional facilities. She's my favorite person. She's really, really cool. But there'll be more info coming about her later this year. We did have Denison's darkest day was what occurred on November 1944 when we had a large butane explosion at Maurice and Morton. So this is where Family Video and Little Caesar's Pizza is. And what happened is at those railroad tracks, a car stopped because a train was coming. They'd made it a kind of a sudden stop because it was before the arms came down and everything. And the butane truck behind them, they nudged. They just a little bump. Well, that bump caused a fracture in that butane truck, and it was spilling gas out, and no one knew, and it was just slowly sinking out and around that neighborhood, and then something ignited it, and it exploded. It killed 10 people at that intersection. This is one of the houses by it. It blew the paint off of houses. Someone had a horse in their backyard, and it was blown through the house next door to it. It was just insane. They had to use, we didn't have an ambulance service at that time. That was funeral homes did the ambulances. We didn't have enough ambulances for that many people, so they actually used school buses to transport them to the hospital. So this was a really, really sad time in our city, and it kind of helped shape the railroad industry a little bit for those railroad crossings and having to give a little more warning. So it did at least have a good outcome that way. On September 1st, 1945, the Madonna Hospital opened. So this was originally the Denison City Hospital that we learned about last time that opened in 1913. By the 40s, it was failing. It was doing really, really badly. That's why cities are not in the hospital business. And we couldn't maintain it anymore. And so a group of nuns offered to remodel it, to completely renovate it, if we would deed it and give them some additional funding. It was harder to get the funding. We weren't able to get all that they wanted. Again, the Chamber of Commerce raised the majority of the money, but it was made possible. They completely renovated it into this structure, and it served Denison for decades until Memorial Hospital was built, which we'll see in a couple more slides. Before we wrap up to the Jubilee, 1946, so this was really early for this kind of thing in Texas, but salaries for African American and Caucasian teachers were equal in Denison. In 1946, the school board voted to equalize those. So that's kind of one of those things to be proud of. April 20th, 1946, General Eisenhower, at this point he's just a general, he hasn't been president yet. He visits Denison, and he did a speech in Forest Park. 50,000 people attended. So that would have really racked up some numbers, don't you think, for Hotel Motel, Donna? Eisenhower did give his speech. He had I don't think this was at this one. He comes back, and then we'll talk about it. But the Denison Kiwanis Club was also formed later that year in 46. 1947, we finally got to have a birthday bash. It was our 75th. We had parades, contests, all kinds of stuff. All cities are big about their logos. This was the logo that they had for that event. So, we talked about the chamber and how they were always funding stuff and always doing different things. And sometimes they did that to their own detriment. They would, if you read their minutes, they would take out a loan at the beginning of the meeting so that they could survive another 30 days, but then fund projects throughout the meeting because they knew how important it was. It was really, really interesting. But by 1948, they finally had enough funding and they had some land that they were able to build their own home. It's the first permanent building they ever owned, and it is a Donald Mays design. So Donald Mays is kind of our Frank Lloyd Wright here in town. You know, he's the big deal. One of his houses was on the home tour this last year, and it was really, really cool. And this building just underwent a big restoration effort and now looks just like this again. It was built to accommodate a second story, but that building next to it at the time was owned by Donald Mays' dad, Dr. Joseph Mays. Dr. Joseph Mays said, "I will sell these lots to the Chamber of Commerce as long as they only build a one-story building." Well, so he built it to where it could hold two, but he wasn't going to go against his dad and build a two-story. And it's because Dr. Mays didn't want those second-floor windows blocked. So that's why it's a one-story building downtown. Another exciting thing that happened, Terrell High School won their second state championship. So everyone knows about Denison High winning their state championship in the 80s, but Terrell actually won 2 state championships before then. Their first was in 1947 when they won a 13-0 game against Orange Wallace High, and then they won once again in 1948 against the same team. And both games were played here at Munson Field, so kind of cool there. One thing I did forget was the Jones Park. If you're ever around the Houston School, over in the Donald Mays district, there's Jones Park. That was made in 1947, and that was one of the only parks for the longest time in Denison ever named after a woman. It's named for Janice Jones, who was Minnie Jones's daughter. And Janice died unexpectedly and would have been the heir to a large fortune here in Denison. And so her mother donated all of that land and park equipment to be a public park forever. And there's a monument in there for her as well. And then later on, in 1953, she created the Jones Trust, which funds the library. It's one of the largest endowments for a library in North Texas. So now we're starting to get into the really exciting time. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, Denison was the happening place. So in 1954, we got a new high school. It was accepted on May 23rd, 1954, and the first classes were in September. This high school is now Scott Middle School, and it's changed a little bit. There's been additions and everything, but it still looks basically like this. Now it has the Eisenhower Auditorium and everything like that. November 26th of the same year, the new viaduct that went over Austin Avenue was opened. Before that, it curved. So it started one way, you made an S curve, and then you went back down. And the reason was, on this end, one of the city councilmen owned a business, and then down here on the next block, another city councilman owned a business, and they both wanted their businesses to do well, so that's how they did it. At this point, there were only 3 city councilmen, so to be fair to that poor mayor, 2/3 majority was an easy thing to win then. But the new viaduct was created that went directly straight over, and now that's still what we have today. In 1954, the security building, which was that first skyscraper that we talked about last time that was ever built in Texas, it was demolished. It was deemed a safety hazard. And the reason we saw this was it was a professional building. It was where all the doctors worked. It was where the dentists worked. It had its own person that manned the elevator and stayed in there all day and just rode up and down with people. And they eventually left to find more plentiful parking and to find more suburban areas that had, one-story offices, that kind of thing. So the building was demolished from the top down. If you look at the very top right-hand corner, that's a man standing on the corner taking it off brick by brick. We've got a couple of pictures of it because it just fascinates me. If you look here, you can see the the man that everyone calls Old Stoneface, and then below him was the entry door. To give you an idea of how big that entry door is, that's a tractor driving through the middle of it, and it doesn't even come halfway up. The building that would replace this one was designed by Donald Mays, and I'll show you it in the next slide, but Donald Mays was able to take one of those capitals from the column, and when he flipped it upside down, it was table height, so he just put a top on it and put it in his backyard as a table. So they were huge pieces. The man at top, Old Stoneface, he's carved out of one piece of stone, and the artist that they hired to do it was just a random guy that got off of a train. He was not anyone that anyone in town knew. He was paid hourly, so he frequently took coffee and alcohol breaks, the newspaper said. He never showed a drawing to anyone, never showed a rendering, did not sketch it on the piece, just started chiseling away and created that, which he can have all the coffee breaks he wants because that's pretty impressive. So what happened was, as they tried to topple Old Stoneface down, they didn't realize that the basement of this building extends underneath the sidewalk, almost out into Main Street. So he crashed down, went right through the sidewalk, and landed in that basement. So then they had to pick him up and out. And by that point, he was a local legend, and so someone purchased him and put him at their gas station here in town. And he was eventually moved outside of town, but if you go out East Main to Middle Road, he's still there. So it's pretty cool, and he's about this tall. It's pretty interesting to see.
Is he in someone's yard?
He's in front of a storage building, like a metal building, yeah. I made Aaron get out and take my picture with him once. I mean, he's cool. I want to bring him back downtown. I think it'd be a really cool piece. But this is the building that replaced it, and it was a department store. This building is just in this block right here. It's 331. We'll learn more about it in our very final segment as well, because it's got some exciting stuff on the future. So what they did, they kept the original basement, so the basement still goes under the sidewalk. Get ready for that, Elsie, in the 300 block. That's going to be our interesting area there as we construct a new sidewalk over that. And they kept the back foundation of it. So if you look behind this building, there are huge stone blocks at the bottom and going up the side, and that's the original security building from the 1890s. That's its foundation. So it's really pretty cool. 1957, Denison got a new admin building. Prior to this, all administration offices were inside of the schools, which shocked me. I had just grown up always knowing an admin building, so I didn't know that they were ever in schools. My wife went to a tiny town school, and their superintendent was right there in the high school. But this was built on Myrick Avenue. It still exists today, and this was their first breakaway to get out of the old high school. And you can see it only had about 12 desks is all the personnel they had back in that day. 1957 also saw Lake Texoma go over the spillway for the first time. So once every 100 years, 1957, first time. In 1958, Lane, the cotton mill, and the Hyde Park area, they were all annexed into the city of Denison. So these were their own communities prior to this. And this was what the Lane School looked like around that time. And then in that same year, in June, a study was also launched to possibly explore getting a community college here in Denison. The interesting thing about this is that study came out of, again, the Chamber of Commerce, their education committee. Can you guess which town did not want a community college? Sherman, because they had a college, so they didn't want anything that could compete with it. So it kind of became a big deal that we started doing this study. And luckily for us, it worked out, and we got a county college, but it kind of created some tensions right then. But Denison was on the move, and we were really growing, and early leadership saw this need. And the reason that chamber had all of that power and all of the stuff they were doing is because, like I said, we only had a small council. So this was really like the city council. This is where they had 12 people, so they had more minds coming together to really get to talk about these ideas. In 1958 as well, Denison saw a new First Baptist church. This is what their old church looked like. I didn't include a new picture because the new one is what it looks like today. So I just want to kind of give you all an idea of what it used to look like. They were one of the first churches downtown to build a new church, and we'll see that kicked off a downtown new church craze. Everyone wanted a new church after them. They were the trendsetters. Oh, okay, this one's a really cool one. So March 3rd, 1959, Denison awarded the first Scholastic Letter Awards ever in the country. No one had ever gotten a Scholastic Letter Award ever, which I didn't realize was not a thing always as long as letter jackets had been a thing. But it was such a big deal that Life magazine came down, NBC televised the event, President Eisenhower sent a letter, Germany, their chancellor, sent a letter and wanted to know how we did it so that they could do it. It was insane. Well, at this point, we were still a segregated community, so Terrell High School also did this, and they did theirs on March 23rd, 1959. And so if you look at the guy that's second from the left on the back row, that is Councilmember Obie Greenleaf. And he got the first letter jacket. Yes. And I asked him where it was, and he said he couldn't remember, but he hopes he could find it. I was like, please find it. So, and I've got the names of all of the individuals, but it's really, really cool that this is not too long ago. I mean, he sat right there next to me for 3 years. So really, really cool. Okay, so next, so after, like I said, that we saw the Baptist church start renovating, we saw that security building being torn down. Well, the next one was the banks. They wanted to kind of join in. So Citizens National Bank, they had a really old building. It was built around 1896. They're like, you know what, it's time for something new, something modern. Who do they call on? Donald Mays. Eloise Munson was the president of the board. So she really admired all of his work. They commissioned him to design this building here. It took up most of that block right across the street. So this was State National, that was Citizens. This one was owned by Clara Blackford Smith, and that one was Eloise Munson, and they were like the original frenemies, okay? These were two Titan women that did some serious battle across this street. But he designed this really, really cool building. It had mosaics all on the floor on the inside, and had this big clock face on the side so that downtown shoppers could know when they needed to go out and feed their meter, because parking you had to pay, because you could not find a spot downtown. It was really, really big, and we're almost to that problem again, which is, as we'll see, is a good problem. You know, that's what they needed in the 60s. It meant downtown was alive. And it was formally dedicated September 4th, 1960, and just a really, really cool building. 1962, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Park was created. And so that land that park is on was owned by the Black Chamber of Commerce, and they donated that land to the city to be used as a park, with it being named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Park. And that park was just rededicated 2 years ago, and it's really, really pretty cool. Remember I talked about that study that we had for a community college. By 1963, that study was found that we did indeed need one. So we went to the polls, and it went to the county polls, and it passed, even in the county. And a $2 million bond issue was passed to build the new college. Does anyone know who designed the new college? Donald Mays. He designed everything. 63, we saw the Dr. and Mrs. Paul Pierce Memorial Foundation created. 63, 64, they started constructing those new buildings at Grayson College. In 1964, Golden Rule School, so this was the school that served the cotton mill, it consolidated with Denison ISD. So while it had been annexed into the city, it wasn't formally part of Denison School District. And you can kind of see that white marker right there in the middle, and that's their cornerstone that used to be on the building. And the person that was their original kind of superintendent was B Munson Jr. So he served Denison schools and the cotton mill schools, because that was his family's business. And this is kind of what their school looked like when they joined the Denison School District. And the reason that we started seeing some of this is because Texas started changing the way school districts were financed. So a lot of these smaller schools had to come into the bigger school districts, and we needed them as well so that that financing could equal out. Otherwise, we both lost out. So also included in that bond issue to create the Grayson County Junior College was a new $200,000 sub-courthouse. This was something that Denison had been working on since the 40s when we went to the state legislature and actually created law that made it available to have a sub-courthouse. Before that time, you couldn't even have one in your community. The courthouse was the courthouse. But we had always been almost as big as Sherman, and we kind of had that chip on our shoulder, so we wanted our own. So we worked on it since the 40s, finally got it passed with that Grayson County bond issue, and now we have our own sub-courthouse, designed by Donald Mays. We also got our very first junior high, Hughes Junior High School. It was named after F.B. Hughes, who was a longtime superintendent. Its name was eventually changed to B. McDaniel once the school was moved over here in 1986. So our other big project was Memorial Hospital. Like I talked about, that was kind of what put Madonna Hospital out of business. Memorial was a bigger facility. It was what eventually became Texoma Medical Center. And what's interesting is it was built a lot like TMC was built when they first did it now. The top floor was just a shell. They didn't build out. And then within just 2 years of opening, they had to build that floor out. Then a couple of years later, they had to expand. Then they had to add an ER. Then they had to, it just grew and grew just like it is today. So it's really, really kind of interesting to see how the two parallel. The unique thing, the reason it's called Memorial Hospital is because it was community funded. All of it was paid for by members of the community. Eloise Munson and Clara Blackford Smith were huge donors. There was the Munson Radiology Center. They would buy equipment every year. It was really, really cool. This was, as we'll see later on, is eventually sold, and that all becomes one of our largest foundations we have to date. Our last passenger train departed Denison July 1st, 1965. Remember, we used to have about 50 passenger trains a day. Grayson County College finally opened in fall of '65. That's what it looked like when it opened. It's grown a lot since then. I think the students will tell you the parking hasn't grown. They have to walk pretty far sometimes, I think. September 1st, '65, President Eisenhower came back to Denison and he named the Eisenhower Auditorium. And then also that year, Waples Methodist Church decided it was time to build a new $1 million church facility at their site on Main Street, and it was that Mark Lemon design. So this is kind of shows you his growth from the Raynal School to this. Not to be outdone, the Presbyterians had to quickly follow behind, and they dedicated a new $285,000 facility. They didn't use Mark Lemon, they used Donald Mays. As Eloise Munson was on the board of this church, and she had just used him over here. We did also see a large fire. Madden's department store, which was right across the street at 301, caught fire on January 14th of that year and was completely destroyed. The amount of damages was $600,000, and it would take a long time for that to be cleaned up so that it could be rebuilt, and that's the building that we have today. Okay, now the really big thing. Downtown Denison. By the late 50s, early 60s, it was really starting to age. Parking was hard to come by, so people were starting to go to more suburban centers where parking was free, plentiful. Our street was aging really poorly. It was not a brick street by then. By like the 30s and 40s, they had started asphalting over it, layers and layers and layers of asphalt, and then it would crack really badly because it was shifting underneath. And you can see how busy it was too. It was almost a 4-lane road, really, is what it was. So a group of citizens had heard about a project in Colorado and thought, maybe we can try that here. We need to get, exciting and hip and with the times. It's called the Serpentine. What we're going to do is we're going to rip this out and we're going to kind of arc that street back and forth as it goes down. Okay. I want to make sure that wasn't going to catch me. Okay, so they thought, we'll eliminate parking on one side and alternate it each end. We'll do big planters. We're going to make easier walkways because that street was really, really wide. So people didn't walk as much across the street. You would go and you would find another parking spot, or you would have someone hold it because you almost couldn't get across with how many cars there were at some points. Or you didn't want to walk because it was going to take too long and you had paid for some parking, okay? So what they thought was, we will clear off lots along these side streets and make parking, and then this will be dedicated to pedestrians, and it'll be more of a downtown mall. So the only problem was, while the city had been flourishing, it didn't have enough money to fund this project. So a group of downtown merchants came together and created DDI, originally called Denison Downtown Inc. It'd later be called Downtown Denison Inc., as if that didn't get any more confusing. And what they did was they asked each building owner to pay so much per foot. However long your building was, you paid per foot. If you owned a corner building, it was real bad because you paid for that plus the side street. And the side streets are 120 feet long, so you paid for a lot of frontage. But every building owner in the 200, 300, and 400 block paid for it. And what they did, they raised money for the landscaping themselves. They did cakewalks. It was really, really impressive how they raised all of this funding. And what the city agreed was, if they could get the top portion funded, underneath they would try to kind of replace some water lines as they could, kind of update some gas lines, but even then it was really, really limited. Well, they raised all that money and they created the Serpentine. Love it or hate it, it was really, really unique. It was super cool, but it did have its challenges. You know, while they thought the part that didn't have parking would be easy for people to pull off and drop people off, those business owners that didn't have the parking in front of them were kind of upset, as anyone would be. You want to have the spots in front of your business. So it kind of created a little bit of a tense situation there. The other problem was, while the business owners paid for it, there wasn't enough funding left to maintain it. They didn't think about maintenance. So the planters, they did have a problem with people that weren't familiar with Denison at this time that would drive straight and they would break those brick walls. And they kept having to try to fix it, and the business owners couldn't keep affording to do that. And the other thing that really kind of did them in is they thought, well, to help pay for some of this, what we'll have to do is, in those big parking lots we've created, we're going to have to charge for parking. So then you were right back to that same problem. People were paying for parking when they could have gone to like Gibson's or Walmart for free parking. So that's kind of what did this project in. But it was really, really cool. And I've got some color slides to show you. So this was it at their big ribbon cutting, kind of similar to our ribbon cuttings that we get to do on our downtown streetscape now. Here's how it looked once it was all completed. And the unique thing they had to do was they had a big parade when it was finished. And they had to have the high school band come down and practice several times so that they could get used to serpentining a little bit and not like completely just look like a mess. So just really, really cool. And everyone had these awesome neon signs and everything. So it did stop at the 500 block. That's because Jack Barrett owned Barrett's drugstore there and department store, and he was the majority landholder there, and he died before it got to his block, and that just ended it. There was no more fundraising to go for that. That's why it never extended beyond. And the 100 block was mainly owned by the city, had the largest frontage, and there they said they didn't have the money to do that either, so we never really saw the full project get completed. Other things that they didn't really address were like the alleys and that kind of thing. They just didn't have the funding. But one of the most ambitious projects ever that you'll see. And the city that we did kind of mimic this after, Grand Junction, Colorado, still has their Serpentine. Yeah. So it lasted until 1989, so 21 years. And then when it was taken up in 1989, again, all of it was funded by the business owners. They paid to have it removed, again, by the amount of frontage they had, and then they had it asphalted back over. So the way that the Serpentine kind of worked, there was one long straight piece of sidewalk, and you can kind of see it right here. They didn't touch that, so there's still a piece of Serpentine there. If anyone tells you it was removed, it wasn't all. They can walk up and down it all day long. But yeah, and then the big planters that you see, those round ones, there's still a couple of them in front of Main Street Mall. Those are the original planters, and then the rest are by the Polaro house at Munson Park. They're out in front of his fence. So just a really, really incredible project, and something that Herman Ringler, who was a business owner both when the Serpentine was put in and when it was taken out, will tell you, is they didn't lose a single business both times. So it was really pretty cool.
And they tore it down because it just became too difficult to maintain?
It was too difficult to maintain. They couldn't maintain it anymore. It had aged really badly, so you know, today it seems kind of odd that we paid so much for the engineering and everything like that, but they didn't pay for that back then, back in '68. And so I've got some pictures from the '89 tour when they started looking at it. The sidewalks had started heaving in some spots, like because it wasn't engineered correctly. It was a community effort. They just ripped it up. A local contractor from Denison came in and, you know, waved it around. It wasn't, and they had never done any the big water infrastructure that it needs or anything like that. So drainage was a problem, that kind of thing. And the Texas Main Street Board, when they came to tour for Denison to be a Main Street community, recommended removal too. They thought that if you added more parking, it would help revitalize downtown a little bit. We did get special Christmas decorations as well that they put on these. They called these toadstools. They didn't intend for them to look like that, but and I wish I had put a picture of this. When the newspaper first reported the initial drawing, it was a hand drawing. It looks like something I would have drawn. I wish y'all could see what this whole community, just based on this one little faith drawing, oh, they had a lot of faith in whoever was going to do this project. Okay. So our next thing that happened in 1968, St. Xavier's Academy, that big academy we talked about in the early 1900s, it did close. The sisters could no longer accommodate big classes. It wasn't utilized anymore. The Catholic Church bought it, and then they closed it, and it was too expensive for them to maintain, so they tore it down. And this is kind of some pieces of it right before it was removed. And then they built their new education facility on top of it. 1969, that same year, Dwight Eisenhower passed away as well, and they closed downtown businesses in observance. 1970, our population went up to 24,923, and the State National Bank decided it was time to pick up the pace and get where the Citizens National Bank was. So they tore down their building as well and built this new edifice that we're in today. This is kind of what the interior looked like on their opening day. And if you ever banked at Bank of America, it looked just like this all the way up until they closed. In March 1971, I told you Perrin Air Force Base kind of opened back up in its own little phases. It did officially close in 1971. 2,000 military and civil service employees were transferred from the city. So we did lose a lot at the very end of that 50 years. But ever hopeful, we went on ahead and rallied, and we celebrated our 100th birthday. They had gunfights. They had their own jail that they had right in the middle of Main Street. They had a time capsule. Fingers crossed we'll be able to open that soon this year. They had parades. What else did they do? They had fashion shows. They had all kinds of stuff. It was really, really cool. And that was a lot of our inspiration for the 150th came from them. So there's a book up here that has a lot of pictures from the centennial that are really pretty cool to see. And that's all we have for that 50 years. Any questions?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. Somebody watching on our Facebook Live commented when we talked about the last passenger train leaving Denison. Barbara talked booth said she was on that train.
Ah,
So,
does she have the ticket or anything?
we'll ask.
Okay.
They said that there was 50 passenger trains a day going through here,
At the height, at the very height.
so
Mhm.
that would be about what year?
When do you think was its biggest, Steve?
Probably in the 40s.
That's what I would think.
Were they commuter trains, or was it people were using trains because you didn't have planes to?
I think it was mainly because that was the biggest form of transportation. It's just what they were using. Whether that was people coming directly here or just it was stopping and, you know.
I know from some of the postcards, a lot of the students at the church, at the schools came by train. So you can imagine at St. Xavier, just an example, they were coming here by train from all over.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Why do you think y'all need so much parking everywhere?
Listen, back in the day, they thought they really needed it. They really thought it was a big deal. Parking's always good, but you learn a little bit about how your community shapes, and when you do drastic things, that's when it can get a little hairy.
So what
So
are
no-
the things that they've done to try to make parking work down here that have worked and have not worked?
So what they did was DDI transferred a lot of their lots to the city so that they could be free because they wouldn't have to maintain them anymore. They didn't do that until the 80s. Other ones they sold. They owned a lot of the lots where Pickleton Dodge is. They used to own a lot of that. So we've done that. The city also went on ahead because now there's more funding. You know, we're starting to grow really well. So they started purchasing more parking. Another big thing they did was the avenues were not always angle and parallel. So adding that angled parking helped because you could increase the level of parking. So that's something they learned.
So are there any specific plans going forward with the whole D3 thing to address parking in particular?
Just making the off-site parking more accessible. We're working on better signage, better wayfinding.
Enhancing the pedestrian experience.
Yeah, it's because still what we found was it's connectivity is what people want. They want the ease of walking to and from. And if we better utilize the space that we have, then parking won't be as big a problem. It's that we have to utilize the space, and that's why we hire the engineers to do the studies.
And then did you have many residents living on Main Street like you do now?
Back in the 60s? No, they did in the 90s is when they started.
All the buildings were full back in the 40s when they were building, in the 30s when they were building the dam. All these.
A lot of them had, all the doctor's offices were downtown, so every second floor used to be occupied, just not by lofts. They were service industry. Southwestern Bell, their telephone department was downstairs above one of the buildings in the 400 block. Nisha's building was a doctor's office above, pharmacy below. So it's that kind of thing is what you saw rather than loft dweller.
My dad's family moved here back in the late 30s, early 40s, around there. Right behind this State National Bank, there was a hardware store right here on the corner of the alley, and they lived upstairs in the hardware store. Because there was basically there wasn't that many houses to be had around here. My mother knew somebody that lived out south of town that their family was living in a boxcar.
Yep.
Because there was just no place, you know, because of the war, there wasn't a lot of materials available. There were a lot of people. There was even an old, over across from Oakwood Cemetery, when I was a kid, there was still an old passenger car sitting on a lot over there that people used to live in.
Yeah.
You had to live in whatever you could find.
Yeah. My great-grandpa bought a passenger car and put it in his backyard, and that's where part of my grandma's family lived, here in town, over by Houston. So I understand. We had a housing crisis at one point.
Oh yeah, especially when they were building the dam, because I mean, a lot of people, that was a big deal, to get a job out there. I mean, so people came from all over to work. Of course, you had that Air Force Base open, so
Yeah, it was a cool time. This was my favorite 50 years, except for the 50 years we haven't experienced yet, because there's a lot of cool stuff on the horizon. So come for the 4th session for sure. That one's going to be fun.
You said you were gonna follow up on the Denison Hotel and.
The 4th one in the 4th session.
Well, not that.
That's in the 2022 to 2052 one. Yep. I know. You'll have to come back. Had to leave you with a cliffhanger. Thank y'all.